The morning the HOA board sent me a formal written directive ordering me to plow every driveway in Creekside Ridge at no charge or face a lien on my home. I was in my equipment shed doing my monthly hydraulic check on a machine I had bought with 11 years of wages and maintained with the kind of attention most people reserve for things they genuinely love. I read the letter standing next to the truck with grease on my hands and diesel on my boots, and I read it twice the way I read everything twice, and then I folded it very carefully along its original crease and put it in the breast pocket of my work jacket and finished my hydraulic check because the hydraulic check needed to be finished regardless of what any letter said. My name is Dale Cutter. I am 53 years old, a licensed commercial equipment operator with 26 years of experience across residential, municipal, and industrial snow removal contracts throughout the mountain counties of northern Montana, and I have lived in the Creekside Ridge HOA development in Garnet Valley for 7 years. My wife Ellen runs a bookkeeping business from our home office. Our 2 grown children live in Missoula and Bozeman, respectively, and come home for Christmas and look at the mountains from our back porch, with the particular reverence of people who grew up with something beautiful and moved away from it, and have not entirely stopped missing it. We bought our house in Creekside Ridge because the lot backed onto a creek that ran clear and cold from April through October, because the school district had been good when our children needed it, even though they were past needing it by the time we arrived, and because the garage was 3 bays wide and had a concrete floor thick enough to support the weight of the equipment I operated for a living. The development had 68 homes arranged along 4 internal streets that connected to a single entry road, which connected in turn to Garnet Valley Road, which was a county-maintained 2-lane that ran 12 miles to the nearest town. The internal streets were private, owned by the HOA, and each homeowner's driveway was private property belonging to the individual lot. The HOA was responsible for the internal streets. The homeowners were responsible for their own driveways. This arrangement was written clearly in the CC and RS and had been the operational reality of the community since it was developed 14 years ago. For 5 of my 7 years in Creekside Ridge, I had run a private snow removal business serving the community on a contract basis. Not free, a paid service. I had 31 of the 68 households on annual contracts ranging from $800 to $1,200 per season, depending on driveway size and configuration, and I cleared those driveways after every accumulation event on a schedule my clients had agreed to in writing. I also held the HOA contract for internal street clearing, which paid me a flat seasonal rate negotiated annually with the board and which I had held for 4 consecutive years. The business worked well because I was good at it and because I was there. Being there is the most important thing in snow removal at elevation in northern Montana. Being there means your equipment is ready and you know the properties and you start before dawn and you finish before people need to leave for work. I knew every driveway I serviced the way you know a thing you have worked on repeatedly in all conditions, the ones that drain toward the garage, the ones that have a low spot that collects ice, the ones with the specific angle at the street edge that requires a particular blade approach to prevent pushing snow onto the sidewalk. I knew these things because I had been there repeatedly in the dark, when nobody was watching, doing the work correctly. The board president who had negotiated my HOA street contract for the first 3 years was a man named Phil Garrison, a semi-retired civil engineer who had the professional instinct of someone who understood infrastructure and valued people who understood it with him. Phil and I had a working relationship built on the shared language of people who dealt with physical systems and knew that those systems had requirements that were not negotiable regardless of budget preferences. You could not argue a drain grade into running uphill. You could not instruct ice to melt faster because it was inconvenient. The road needed clearing and someone needed to do it correctly, and Phil understood this and paid me accordingly. Phil moved to be closer to his grandchildren in Oregon 14 months ago. His departure from the board created a vacancy that was filled by appointment, and the person appointed was a woman named Constance Heller, who had moved to Creekside Ridge 2 years prior and who had been on the HOA Architectural Committee for 18 months with a level of engagement that suggested she found community governance satisfying in a way that most people did not. Constance was 63, a former corporate procurement officer from Chicago, and she brought to the HOA presidency the specific perspective of someone who had spent 20 years negotiating vendor contracts downward and who viewed every service relationship as a procurement exercise in which the goal was to minimize cost while maximizing obligation. She had opinions about everything the community spent money on, and she expressed those opinions with the organized persistence of someone who had been doing it professionally for 2 decades. She came to my door in September, 6 weeks after taking office and 4 weeks before I typically began preparing for the season. She had a printed spreadsheet that she set on my kitchen counter without asking and that showed the community's snow removal expenditures for the past 4 years. My HOA street contract was the largest line item. My individual client contracts, which she had apparently obtained by adding up what she knew about or estimated, appeared as a secondary figure that she had labeled community member discretionary snow removal costs. She said the board had been reviewing operational expenses and had identified snow removal as an area where significant savings were possible. I said, "What kind of savings are you looking for?" She said the board believed that given my presence in the community and my existing equipment, I should be able to absorb the driveway clearing for all 68 homes as part of a consolidated community service arrangement. I said, "You want me to plow 68 driveways for free?" She said, "As part of a community contribution model. Many communities operate this way with resident operators." I said, "The communities you are describing are usually smaller, and the operators in those arrangements are typically retired individuals who use residential equipment for personal use. I operate commercial equipment as a business. Plowing 68 driveways is approximately 9 hours of work per significant storm event. I do this as a livelihood." She said, "We would of course recognize your contribution through a reduction in your HOA dues." I said, "My annual dues are $1,800. 9 hours of commercial plowing at my standard rate is $630. Over a season, with 12 significant events, that is $7,560 of work you are asking me to perform in exchange for $1,800 of dues reduction." She looked at her spreadsheet. She said, "Those numbers seem high." I said, "Those are my actual numbers. I can show you my client contracts and my rate schedule." She said, "We are not looking to audit your business. We are asking about community participation." I said, "I participate in this community by providing a professional service at a fair rate. I have held the HOA street contract for 4 years. I serve 31 households on paid seasonal contracts. That is community participation." She said, "The board believes a community member with your capabilities has a responsibility to contribute more broadly." I said, "Constance, I want to be direct with you. I will not plow 68 driveways without compensation. That is my final position." She gathered her spreadsheet from my counter and said she would take it back to the board. I called Karen Howell that evening. Not the same Karen as in the previous story, but my own attorney, a property and contract specialist named Karen Aldrich in the county seat, who had handled my business formation 7 years ago and who I checked in with annually on contract matters. I described the conversation. Karen said, "Document everything she says and does from this point forward. If the board tries to mandate unpaid services, they are on very shaky legal ground, but that will not stop them from trying. Be prepared." I was already prepared. I had been prepared since the day Constance set her spreadsheet on my counter without asking. The formal board proposal arrived 3 weeks later as a letter, not certified mail, slipped through my mail slot on a Thursday evening. It proposed what it called a community service partnership in which I would provide seasonal driveway clearing for all 68 Creekside Ridge homes as a community contribution, in exchange for a dues waiver and what it called preferred contractor status for the internal street contract. Preferred contractor status meant I would continue to hold the street contract, but the rate would be reduced by 40% from the prior year's negotiated amount. I read the letter at my kitchen table. Ellen was across from me doing client invoices on her laptop. She looked up and said, "What is that?" I said, "They want me to do 9 times the work for a third of the pay." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Say no very clearly and document that I said it." Karen drafted my response. It declined the community service partnership in full. It stated that I would continue to hold the HOA street contract under terms no less favorable than the prior year's agreement, or I would decline to bid. It stated that I would continue to serve my 31 private clients under existing contract terms. It stated that I had no obligation under the CC and RS or any other instrument to provide services to homeowners who had not contracted with me, and that any attempt to compel such services would be legally challenged. It also included a paragraph that Karen had suggested and that I had approved after thinking about it for a full day. It stated that my private client contracts were annual agreements that required renewal each October, and that I would be reaching out to my clients for renewal on schedule, and that given the board's position regarding community service obligations, I wanted the board to be aware that I was under no obligation to renew any contract, and that my service decisions were my own commercial decisions to make. I sent the letter, and then I went through my client list and thought about what I was going to do. I renewed 23 of my 31 contracts. The 8 contracts I did not renew belonged to households where the board members lived or where I had specific knowledge that the homeowner was closely aligned with Constance's position. I sent each of those 8 households a polite notice that I was reducing my client load this season and would not be able to renew their contracts, and wished them well in finding alternative service. 4 of the 8 called me to ask why. I told each of them honestly that I was managing my business capacity and had made decisions about which contracts to prioritize. This was true. I said nothing about the board situation because I did not need to, and because letting people draw their own conclusions is sometimes more effective than explaining things. The HOA street contract negotiation happened in October. Constance came to the table wanting a 40% reduction. I came to the table with Phil Garrison's last contract rate and a 1-sentence opening position, which was that my rate for the coming season would be Phil's rate plus a 3% cost of living adjustment. Constance said that was not acceptable. I said, then the board should seek other bids. She said, we have sought other bids. You are the only qualified operator in the area. I said, that is relevant information. She said, we are not going to pay more than last year. I said, you are going to pay last year's rate plus 3%, or you are going to find another operator. I want your answer by October 21st. They accepted on October 20th. Phil's rate plus 2.5%, which was a compromise I accepted because the difference was small and the principle was intact. The season started in November with 2 moderate events that Summit Clear Services, which was not involved in this story but whose type was, handled adequately. My 23 private clients were cleared efficiently. The 8 households who had not renewed with me either cleared their own driveways or found a part-time operator named Benny Tulsa who worked out of his personal truck and charged low rates because his overhead was minimal and his reliability was correspondingly variable. In December, the HOA sent the letter I described at the beginning, the one I read standing in my equipment shed with grease on my hands. It had been generated, I later learned from Phil Ocaffer, a board member who I trusted and who trusted me, by a motion Constance had brought to the board after Benny Tulsa had cancelled on 3 of his new clients during a November event, and those clients had complained to the board. The motion said that given my professional presence in the community and my existing equipment and contracts, I was uniquely positioned to ensure community-wide driveway access, and that declining to do so for uncontracted households constituted a withholding of essential services that the board had authority to address under the CC and RS emergency provisions. Phil Ocaffer had voted against the motion. He called me the day the letter was sent. He said, I want you to know it was 3-2. I argued against it. The other no vote was Sandra Yee. Constance, Marcus Webb, and Tom Sikula voted yes. I said, what is the CC and our emergency provision language? He read it to me. It said the board had authority to require residents with specialized equipment or expertise to contribute to community safety in declared emergency situations. I said, has the board declared an emergency? He said, Constance declared a snow removal emergency at the same meeting where she brought the motion. I said, based on what? He said, based on the fact that 8 households did not have contracted plowing service. I said, 8 households made decisions about their own driveways. That is not an emergency. He said, I know that. I said that at the meeting. Constance said it was the board's responsibility to ensure all residents had access. I said, Phil, I appreciate you calling. I am going to handle this correctly. Karen's response to the Leon threat went out within 48 hours. It was 6 pages, and it was precise in the way that 6-page letters from property attorneys are precise when the attorney has been following a situation carefully for 2 months and has accumulated significant material. It challenged the emergency declaration on the grounds that no objective criteria for emergency had been met, that 8 homeowners' driveway preferences did not constitute a community-wide emergency, and that the CC&R emergency provision had never previously been invoked and had no implementing regulations defining its scope. It challenged the compelled services demand on the grounds that Montana law did not permit a homeowners association to compel a licensed commercial operator to provide uncompensated services, that my commercial operations were conducted as a private business and not as a community amenity, and that any attempt to place a lien on my property based on my exercise of normal commercial discretion about which clients to serve would be challenged as an abuse of HOA authority and result in a claim for legal fees and damages. It also included something I had specifically requested, a formal notice that I was withdrawing from the HOA street contract effective at the end of the current contract period, which was April 30th, and that I would not be bidding for renewal under the current board leadership. I had thought about this for a long time before I authorized Karen to include it. Withdrawing from the street contract meant the HOA internal roads would be someone else's problem after April. It meant Constance would have to find a replacement. It meant I was walking away from a revenue stream I had held for 4 years. But it also meant I was taking my equipment and my expertise off the table in a way that would be felt and would be visible and could not be characterized as a failure to cooperate, because I had cooperated fully and been met with a directive to work for free. Ellen read the letter draft before Karen sent it. She said, "Are you sure about the contract withdrawal?" I said, if I stay on the street contract under this board, I am signaling that they can do what they did and I will keep working for them. I cannot send that signal. She said, what if the next board is better? I said, then I will bid for the contract under the next board. She said, okay. She went back to her invoices. Karen sent the letter. Constance did not respond for 8 days. On the 9th day, Phil Okafor called me. He said, there was an emergency board session last night. I was not invited. I found out from Sandra Yee this morning. Constance convened it with Marcus Webb and Tom Sikula, and they voted to uphold the fine and proceed with lien proceedings. I said, 3 people. He said, they are claiming a quorum of the present members. Sandra and I were not notified. I said, Karen is going to find that interesting. Karen found it very interesting. She filed an emergency petition in district court within 24 hours challenging the lien proceeding on 2 grounds. First, the procedural irregularity of the 3-person session conducted without notice to the full board. Second, the substantive legal challenge to the underlying directive. She requested a temporary restraining order preventing any lien filing pending judicial review. The judge assigned to the matter was the Honorable Robert Tan in Garnett County District Court. He reviewed the emergency petition, read the 6-page letter, and the HOA's response, which Constance had filed through the HOA's insurance-provided legal counsel, and issued the TRO the same day with a hearing set for 3 weeks out. At the hearing, Constance's attorney argued that the CC&R emergency provision gave the board authority to compel resident contributions during declared emergencies. Judge Tan asked what criteria had been used to declare the emergency. The attorney said the board had exercised its discretionary authority. Judge Tan asked whether they were implementing regulations defining that authority. The attorney said the CC&RS gave broad discretion. Judge Tan said broad discretion still required a rational basis and asked the attorney to explain how 8 homeowners without driveway contracts constituted a community emergency when 60 households had existing service arrangements. The attorney said it was a matter of community equity and ensuring all residents had access. Judge Tan looked at the attorney for a moment. Then he looked at Constance, who was sitting at the respondent table in the composed manner of someone who had prepared extensively for a situation and was discovering that preparation had not addressed the central question. He said, "The court finds that the emergency declaration is not supported by objective criteria, that the CC&R emergency provision cannot be read to compel a licensed commercial operator to provide uncompensated services to private individuals, and that the board's 3-person session conducted without notice to all members did not constitute a valid quorum action under the association's own bylaws. The lien proceeding is permanently enjoined. The petitioner's legal fees in this matter shall be paid by the association." Constance's attorney requested a 15-day stay to seek reconsideration. Judge Tan denied the stay. I was in the hallway outside the courtroom when Constance came out with her attorney. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone who had used a management approach that had always worked before and was encountering the first situation where it had not. I did not say anything to her. There was nothing that needed saying. Phil Okafor called for a formal board review of the emergency declaration and the 3-person session proceedings. He and Sandra Yee, as the 2 board members excluded from the session, filed a formal complaint with the HOA management company, a firm called Northern Ridge Property Management, whose area manager was a professional named Greg Sato, who had been managing community associations for 15 years, and who reviewed the complaint with the attention of someone who had a legal obligation to take it seriously. Greg Sato's review took 3 weeks. His finding was that the 3-person session had violated the association's bylaws, that the emergency declaration lacked the objective foundation required for the CC&R provision invocation, and that the board's conduct in this matter had created significant legal and financial exposure for the association. He recommended a governance review and specifically recommended that the board president consider whether her continued leadership was in the community's best interest. Constance did not resign immediately. She held on for another month, during which the legal fee award from Judge Tan's ruling arrived as a bill to the HOA for $11,400, and during which 3 of her private driveway clients from the prior year asked me if I had any contract openings for the following season, and during which Phil Okafor began organizing a recall petition that had gathered 41 signatures within 2 weeks. She resigned on a Thursday in February. Her email to the community was 4 sentences and mentioned personal reasons and expressed pride in her contributions to Creekside Ridge. Phil Okafor forwarded it to me with a single line. He said, "Sandra is running for president. I think she wins easily." I said I thought so too. Sandra Yee was elected president at the February special meeting. The first item on her agenda as president was a formal board resolution rescinding the emergency declaration and withdrawing any and all directives related to compelled snow removal services. The resolution passed unanimously, 4-0, because Marcus Webb and Tom Sikula had both discovered in the preceding weeks that their votes in the 3-person session were going to be part of the legal record, and had recalibrated their positions accordingly. The second item on Sandra's agenda was a discussion of the HOA street contract for the following season. She called me before the meeting and said she wanted to know if I would be willing to bid. I said, under your leadership, yes. She said, what rate are you thinking? I said, Karen's research shows the prevailing commercial rate for internal road clearing in communities of this size and elevation in northern Montana is $2,200 per activation. I held Phil Garrison's rate for 4 years out of respect for the relationship. I would like to negotiate something fair that reflects current costs. She said, send me a proposal. I sent a proposal. We negotiated over 2 weeks, professionally and without drama, and reached an agreement at a rate that was fair to both parties and that Sandra told me at signing was still less expensive than the alternative bids she had received from Bozeman operators who would have to drive 2 hours to reach the community. I signed the contract on a Monday morning in March in Sandra's kitchen over coffee. Ellen came with me because Ellen likes to be present for things that matter. Sandra had made cinnamon rolls, which she said was a thing she did when something went well. The coffee was good, and the rolls were good, and outside the window the last of the season's snow was melting off the ridge in the March sun the way it does in northern Montana when winter finally releases its grip, not all at once, but gradually, as though the mountains are allowing themselves to be persuaded. The 8 households who had not renewed with me the previous season mostly came back. 6 of the 8 reached out before April to ask about the following season. I renewed 5 of them. The 6th was Marcus Webb, whose 3-person session vote I had noted and whose call I returned with a polite message that I was fully contracted for the coming season. This was not entirely accurate, but it was accurate enough. Benny Tulsa continued operating his part-time service for 3 households who seemed satisfied with his pricing and comfortable with his variable reliability. I harbored no resentment toward Benny. He was doing what he could with what he had, and his clients had made their choices freely. That was how it was supposed to work. In April, I did the end-of-season maintenance on my truck. The full inspection I did every spring, oil, hydraulics, blade edge, all of it. I did it in the 3-bay garage with the thick concrete floor that had been one of the reasons I bought this house. The garage smelled like diesel and metal and winter work, the specific smell of equipment that has been used correctly and maintained correctly and will be ready when it is needed. Ellen came out while I was finishing the blade inspection and leaned against the door frame with her coffee. She said, good season overall. I said, better at the end than the beginning. She said, you handled it right. I said, Karen handled it right. She said, Karen had something to work with because you documented everything from the first day. I said, that is the job. Document everything and do the work correctly and let the record speak. She said, 26 years, and you still believe that. I said, 26 years, and it keeps being true. She went back inside. I finished the blade inspection, closed the garage, and stood in the driveway for a moment looking at the ridge behind the house where the last snow was retreating up toward the summit in the March warmth. By June, it would be gone entirely, and the ridge would be green, and the creek behind the house would be running high from the melt. In October, it would snow again. In November, I would start the season. At 4:30 on the first storm morning, I would have the blade down before anyone else in Creekside Ridge was awake, and the roads would be clear before the first car needed them. That was the job. That had always been the job. The rest was paperwork. Thumbnail text, she ordered him to plow 68 driveways for free. The judge had other ideas.